This is Tom Kozlik, the head of research and analytics at HilltopSecurities. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this episode of our HilltopTalks Politics and Finance podcast series for 2021. During these discussions, we consider topics that intersect the worlds of politics and finance at the federal, state, and local levels in the United States. We often concentrate on issues related to U.S. public finance and the municipal bond market. Today, we're going to review a topic that comes up in almost every conversation that I have with municipal bond market observers, and that topic is really the search for an answer of how public finance entities, and especially state and local governments, are spending the funds they receive from the federal government's CARES Act and Rescue Plan Act. To help answer that or those questions, we are joined again, thankfully, by Amanda Kass. Amanda, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Amanda is an associate director at the Government Finance Research Center at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's a PhD in urban planning and policy, and she's been closely following this topic. You can see all of Amanda's commentary at her website, https://amandakass.blog. Under the notebooks section on her website, she published a commentary called "How Many States Shared CARES Act Money with Local Governments?" For those interested in this topic, please take a look at that recent post. And before we jump into the specific details with Amanda, I wanted to review and give everyone listening a refresher on the federal government fiscal policy relief that public finance entities received in the last year and in 2021 so far. President Trump signed the $2.7 trillion CARES Act, or the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, into law back on March 27th in 2020. That was the largest COVID-19 relief package we saw out of Washington, and it sent $150 billion to state and local governments. But that money also had some pretty severe constraints. That CARES Act, the overall fiscal policy, also created that municipal liquidity facility that so many municipal bond market observers, I'm sure, remember. Then in March of 2021, President Biden signed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act into law. That was the sixth phase of COVID-19 fiscal policy relief, and that Rescue Plan Act included a significant amount of relief for public finance entities in the amount of, by my count, totaled about $650 billion. $130 billion of that was directed to K through 12 schools, and $350 billion went to state and local governments. And that brings us back to Amanda's November 9th commentary, where she focused on the 2020 CARES Act spending. And Amanda, how is it that you found state and local governments approached not just the CARES Act, but the CARES Act process and those severe restrictions that I mentioned? The requirements were pretty strict. How did that impact state and local government's approach to spending the CARES Act funds?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a great question and a great kind of recap. So I kind of think the CARES Act program was I'd like to describe it as like flexibly strict. Because there was kind of the broad parameter of what state and local governments could spend the money on, and that was it had to be something tied to the public health emergency or economic disruption of COVID-19. But within that, there was kind of broad latitude. So state and local governments could spend the money on PPE for public employees, but they could also use the money to create emergency rent relief programs for their residents in their community. So there was some latitude. And we saw governments kind of approach it, I think, a little bit cautiously, and it evolved over time because there was no existing program infrastructure for the CARES Act federal relief to state and local governments, right? So we kind of can think of it as they're flying the plane as they're building it. And Treasury's guidelines about the program evolved over time. I looked at it before we started our conversation. I think there was 9 different changes to the Treasury's kind of guidelines for what the money could and couldn't be spent on.
So even saying that it was strict might be a little bit of an overstatement, because not only was it it doesn't sound like it was so strict that they weren't able to use it, but it also the guidelines evolved over time, is what you're saying. Okay.
Exactly. And it was stricter in comparison to the American Rescue Plan Act program.
Do you have an idea of how much of that $150 billion coronavirus relief fund money has already been spent? And where can we see that data?
Yeah, so that's an important thing too. Another reason, going back to the, how were they approaching it, is one thing that's important to note, right, is the deadline for the spending changed. Originally, all the money had to be spent by December 2020, and it was extended to December 31st, 2021, meaning that all the money has to be spent at the end of this calendar year. And I just looked up the data, and it looks like about 90% of the money has been spent thus far. So about 10% remaining to be spent.
Is there some place that you have identified that folks could take a look at that shows, I'm not sure if it's interactive, but is there a federal government or is there some kind of spot where folks can see that data?
The data is available on the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee's website, pandemicoversight.gov. And they have a kind of interactive dashboard, so you can really drill down to a specific project within a specific state or local government. But you can also download the entire data set, which as a researcher, I'm interested in the entire data set, and I want to be able to kind of analyze it to get at these like bigger trends of, did we see states spend money in ways different than cities? Did we see kind of regional differences? And it's a very large data set, so I'm still kind of working with it to try and kind of clean it up and analyze it to answer some simple questions like how many states shared some of their money with local governments.
So were you able to get an idea of whether or not there were some trends that were shared by states and local governments with regard to how it is that money was being spent and how it was shared?
Not with that data set yet. So I think that the data is very granular. So again, it's great if you really want to drill down on a specific project or a specific state or city. It's not good if you're a researcher like me and you want to analyze the entire data set. We did have the Treasury put out an interim report at kind of very early on with the CARES Act spending. And at that time, states had only spent about a quarter of the money. But that we could see that two biggest buckets they were spending was transferring to local governments and then spending on public health expenses. That was kind of very early on. So who knows if that holds true today.
In other words, that could have evolved and or changed based on, okay. So we'll have to make sure that we come back and hit that after you have a chance to go through that data in more detail. What about where the Rescue Plan Act spending is concerned? From a big picture perspective, I'm thinking, first of all, it was more money that state and local governments were able to get from the Rescue Plan Act. What is it that state and local governments are likely to be considering when they're thinking about those funds?
Yeah, so it's not only more money, but it's also more governments that are guaranteed some portion of the money. So the CARES Act money, it was only very large cities with populations of at least 500,000 that got the money. Versus the ARPA program, it's tens of thousands of cities that are getting the money. And the kind of buckets of spending categories are broader. So it can be used for the economic and health effects of COVID-19, but governments can also use it for revenue replacement. They can use it for premium pay, and then they can also use it for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And kind of importantly, while Treasury issued its interim report back in May, it hasn't issued its final report, its final rules for the program. And so I think lots of governments have come out with plans for how they are going to use the money, but I think we might see some changes to that, or in some places might kind of still be hesitating to kind of finalize their spending plans until Treasury comes out with its final rule.
By and large, I'd have to now. There is an expiration, or I should say, a date by which their they need to be spent. They need to spend the Rescue Plan Act money. And when exactly is that?
The money has to be allocated by 2024, and then the actual kind of cash flow of it has to happen by the end of 2026.
It's a number of years, but I guess and this is one of the things that I've been keeping in mind, in that, you know, this is still a one-time money, and so there's a certain amount of spending line items that entities are likely to be considering with this money. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I think the kind of finance best practice idea is one-time money like this, even though it can be spent over a number of years, should be used for one-time purposes. Meaning you wouldn't want to kind of necessarily create an ongoing program or hire kind of new permanent employees for which the city or state would have a spending obligation past 2026.
One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot over the last, not just couple of weeks after the October jobs number came out, but over the last several months, when, you know, I've seen since the Rescue Plan Act was signed into law in March of this year, the amount of state and local government jobs did come back. Those numbers started to recover. But in August, September, and October, the number of state and local government jobs has actually dipped over the last couple of months. And one of the things that I'm remembering is that back in March or April, the Treasury Secretary specifically mentioned that one of the things that this $350 billion for state and local governments, one of the things that they were expecting this could do is, maybe the better way to describe it is maybe change a policy error that they saw after the Great Recession, in that there wasn't significant relief that went into state and local governments, and state and local government employment finally dipped out in 2013, and didn't recover to pre-Great Recession levels, I think, till 2018 or 2019. And the Treasury Secretary wrote about how that was a drag on overall economic growth. That's a long way of saying perhaps on the one hand, they thought that this $350 billion might help correct that policy error. That being said, what you're describing is a circumstance in which they probably wouldn't be using this money to hire back ongoing people that are going to be employed after the next 2 or 3 years, right? So am I thinking about that the right way?
I think so. And I think every state and local government is kind of going to be using their own unique circumstances, their own kind of political and policy priorities, and thinking through and deciding how they use this money. And kind of one way that the spending could indirectly bolster city finances for the long term, right, is boosting the economic recovery, right? So if your local economy is taking a hit, maybe you use the spending not on hiring back public employees or hiring new public employees, but you use it for an initiative in your city or your state that you think is going to spur economic recovery, which will, down the road, help your revenue tax collections.
So those could be kind of the way that I'm thinking about it as you're describing, political or economic development priorities that might have been even identified before the COVID crisis, but this might be a financial way for them to be able to enact those ideas?
Potentially, if you have to kind of create, right, a rationale tying it to kind of COVID. And importantly, the Biden administration has said that they want the money to be spent in such a way that would address pre-COVID inequities that made the impact of COVID so kind of uneven across race and income lines, right? So it could be used for a pre-existing COVID priority as long as you can kind of tie it to the kind of larger policy and program aims of the ARPA program.
Now, has there been, is there, like with the CARES Act money, I mean, this has only been a couple of months, but is there data that shows the percentage of the Rescue Plan Act money that has been already expended and or spent?
There's not kind of aggregate data. The National League of Cities has a kind of COVID tracker that is looking obviously specifically at cities and is capturing some cities' spending plans. Mm-hmm. And so some places have passed plans for how they're going to spend the overall money, but that doesn't mean that the money is actually being spent. It's just an authorization for a program or an authorization for a spending line item.
So we still don't yet have necessarily an aggregate level, but it's only a couple of months, right? So I would imagine that as time goes on, we'll be able to see that kind of data. Is there? You mentioned some of the reporting rules, and you mentioned that the rules are looser this time around. How is that factoring into some of the individual plans from what it is that you've been able to parse through?
Sure. So there, again, it's kind of 4 different program areas that they can spend on. It's public health and negative economic impacts of COVID. Governments can use it for revenue replacement and then use the money for their general government services, premium pay, water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. Mm-hmm. What I kind of suspect is going to happen is that governments, to the extent that they can, are going to allocate the money to the revenue replacement category, in part because the kind of reporting rules, program evaluation strikes me as a little bit easier if you're using it in the revenue replacement category than if you're using it in some of the other spending categories where the Biden administration wants the kind of outcome of the spending tracked much more closely.
So, Amanda, what is it? I know that you follow what's happening in the city of Chicago very closely. Is there something happening? Have they put together a specific plan, or is there political background with how it is that some would like to see that money spent and how it might actually be spent in Chicago?
Yeah, so Chicago, I think Chicago is kind of an interesting case to unpack some of the kind of complexity of what's going on and how it kind of layers together with local politics and local financial condition. So the city of Chicago, the mayor proposed and the city council subsequently approved this Chicago Recovery Plan, which is a multi-year kind of spending plan for how the city is going to use its ARPA money. But it did this simultaneously with passing the 2022 budget. And then to add a little even more kind of complexity to it, in addition to the federal ARPA money, the Chicago Recovery Plan is also being financed with a new bond issuance. So a couple of different revenue streams to finance this multi-year recovery plan while also passing the 2022 budget.
It's interesting. So what, from a year-over-year perspective, and I guess what I mean by year-over-year perspective is, do you have a sense of the amount of money that Chicago is receiving from the Rescue Plan Act, and kind of, is there a way to track exactly where it is that they're planning on having that go or be spent on, and how much from a revenue replacement perspective that includes?
Yeah, so the Chicago's getting nearly $2 billion in federal aid from the Fiscal Recovery Program. I think the kind of easiest way to track it, or the kind of most detailed, is in the recovery plan document itself. And in that, it looks like the plan was to use almost 70% of that money on revenue replacement, and then use the other chunk on kind of new initiatives, and then also financing initiatives with that bond issuance.
So do you have a sense for other cities? Now, is that plan, it sounds like that plan is pretty set in stone. I mean, if Chicago's planning, if they've already incorporated into their budget, their plan, I would imagine that it could be changed if they need to make a change. But it sounds like that's pretty set in stone. Are other state and local governments throughout the country, have they kind of jumped at this as quickly as Chicago has? It's interesting because one of the things that I'm thinking about is I was thinking about a conversation that I had with someone several months ago who said one of the things that they were planning on doing was taking some time, first of all, to see how the CARES Act money was expended in that person's state and in their area and region to make sure that that money was expended, and then to take a look at the Recovery Act money to see how it is that they could spend that most effectively. But because, as you mentioned, the time that the Rescue Plan Act money needs to be spent, it doesn't need to be spent for several years. So this individual recommended that state and local governments took a little time to put a plan in place. Do you feel as though there are others that are, you already mentioned that there are some who are waiting for the final rules to come out, but do you get a sense that there are others that might not necessarily even be waiting for that, but might be waiting till maybe the next budget cycle to put those types of plans together?
So I think lots of places, lots of state and local governments have put at least preliminary plans together. And the ARPA money is going out in tranches, right? So you don't get the second tranche of money until you kind of spend your first tranche of money. And then also as part of the program, states in larger cities had to submit these recovery performance reports to Treasury, as well as kind of project and spending reports. So they had to, the design of the program or the reporting requirements of the program are such that states and cities have had to come up with at least general kind of spending plans for how they are going to be using the money.
So are those spending, not just the spending requirements themselves, but the reporting requirements, is that in some way? So it sounds like that might be driving how it is that their proposals are created. Are the reporting requirements factoring into how it is that they're spending the money at all, from what you can tell?
Yes, exactly. I suspect so. Again, okay. I think when I read through the reporting requirements, it struck me that it's kind of more stringent if you're using the money on kind of a new program or a new initiative rather than using the money for revenue replacement. And so that's why I suspect somewhat that governments, to the extent that they can, would allocate the money to revenue replacement rather than kind of new programs, which then they have to kind of evaluate and kind of provide those evaluation or outcomes to Treasury.
I see. So it's not even so part of it is a financial effectiveness question, but also it's a reporting requirement that could be driving them to use it for that purpose. I see. Okay, that makes sense. Amanda, one of the things that has been an issue for some time is whether or not under the Rescue Plan Act, state and local governments would be able to use those funds to pay off short-term debt or short-term loans. That's I don't think that we've gotten an answer to that. Have we gotten an answer to that? And or what is it that the state and local governments that did that, what is it that they're planning on doing if they're not able to use the funds for that?
We haven't gotten the kind of final word on it because Treasury's final rule hasn't come out yet. And so Chicago is one of the entities that it took out short-term debt to deal with revenue loss from COVID. Initially, Chicago was planning to use the federal money to directly pay that money to pay the loan off. But then Treasury came out with its interim rule and said the money can't be used to pay off debt. So then the kind of Chicago's plan changed, and it was going to use the federal money for revenue replacement. That then would kind of free up some of its corporate or general fund money, and then it could pay the debt off. So indirectly would be able to use some kind of financial maneuvering, the fungibility of a general fund to pay off the debt. And then there was kind of a political fight over this with some progressive organizations and elected officials requesting that Treasury kind of make the rules even stricter so that money couldn't even be indirectly used to pay off debt. It seems like Chicago found kind of a workaround for kind of paying off the short-term debt that it took out. But again, we haven't seen the final rule yet, so we kind of don't know if Treasury is going to change that one way or not.
Well, let me ask a final question. I think that it's a good transition because you just mentioned we're still waiting for the final rules from Treasury. What are the other big issues or the big questions that are outstanding that we're waiting for Treasury to answer in that process?
So I think the other kind of big thing that I'm looking to see if there's a change is in the revenue replacement category. So after the interim rule was issued, there was a comment period, and some people commented that the way that the revenue replacement was to be calculated in the interim rule was kind of overly strict, or the calculation didn't let the city or state capture how it had actually been impacted by COVID, and so was requesting that Treasury change the rules and kind of make the revenue replacement calculation kind of broader so that their actual impact could be felt and realized, and they could use the money in that way. So that's a big category that I'm looking to see if they make any more changes to.
So we're recording this on November 16th. Do we have an idea of when the final rules are expected to be released?
I have not seen anything indicating when the kind of final rule will come out, maybe any day now. Again, the comment period ended in July, and the interim rule came out in May. So I think any moment now, especially because, states and cities are having to come up with plans and begin to spend this money.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll see what happens when that final information comes out and how the spending evolves, and we'll get back together and discuss that then. I appreciate your time, Amanda. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks very much to everyone who tuned in and downloaded our recording today. Thanks for listening. Again, I'm going to thank Amanda for joining me, and I really enjoyed our discussion. I hope all the listeners did. For those interested, you can see the recent HilltopSecurities economic and municipal commentary and listen to our podcasts by going to HilltopSecurities.com/commentary, and you can follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I mentioned before, but want to reiterate that you can see all of Amanda's commentary at her website, https://amandakass.blog. You should also follow her on Twitter as well. Thanks again, everyone. We look forward to bringing you more color in the future related to topics that intersect the world of politics, finance, and public finance. This has been Tom Kozlik from Hilltop Securities. Thanks for listening to Hilltop Talks, a Hilltop Securities podcast where we navigate the impact of politics and finance on the financial markets. For those interested, you can view our Hilltop Securities economic and municipal commentary by visiting HilltopSecurities.com/municipal-commentary and HilltopSecurities.com/economic-commentary. You can also follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thanks again, everyone, for subscribing, tuning in, and participating. We look forward to bringing you more color in the future on topics that intersect both the world of politics and finance. This has been Tom Kozlik at Hilltop Securities. This communication is intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or investment advice, nor is it an offer or a solicitation of an offer to buy or sell any investment or other specific product or service. Financial transactions may be dependent upon many factors such as, but not limited to, interest rates, tax rates, supply and change in laws, rules and regulations, as well as changes in credit quality and rating agency considerations. The effect of such changes in such assumptions may be material and could affect the projected results. Any outcome or result Hilltop Securities or any of its employees may have achieved on behalf of our clients in previous matters does not necessarily indicate similar results can be obtained in the future for current or potential clients. Hilltop Securities makes no claim the use of this communication will assure a successful outcome. For additional information, comments, or questions, please contact Hilltop Securities, Inc. Hilltop Securities is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hilltop Holdings, New York Stock Exchange, ticker symbol HTH. Hilltop Securities is located at 717 North Harwood Street, Dallas, Texas, 75201. Phone number 833-4-HILLTOP, HILLTOP, and is a member of the New York Stock Exchange the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and the Securities Investor Protection Corporation.